welcome everybody. This is a very cool kickoff today. It's going to be pretty freewheeling. Um, Thanks everybody for being here. What we're talking about is the sort of historic case for Integrative Metatheory 2.0, and then what do we do about that? What do we mean by it? And what are we trying to accomplish with the new Symposium series? And we'll jump into all of those different pieces as we go. Where to start? The Metacrisis is an integration crisis. It's an integration crisis. It's a learning crisis of that we can think about in one way as fragmented knowledge that has occurred with the proliferation of the modern knowledge infrastructure over the last several hundred years, which is extraordinary and tells us everything we want to know about anything, but sort of not anything about everything. And so that's a real problem because we're at a spot in the 21st century where now all of a sudden we have a truly integrative set of problems at a planetary level where we actually need everything kind of knowledge. We need big picture views, synoptic views to start to make sense of and to overcome what Clement calls the planetary cooperation barrier. And many other people have talked about, in different ways. And so the differentiation of modernity was obviously huge progress, but it has so fractured our overall epistemic infrastructure that we can't make sense of where we are, and our knowledge production processes are sort of broken. Now, integrative metatheories over the last 5 or 6 decades arguably are the most disciplined response we have to this problematic. A set of people who have come together or come along and tried to redevelop big picture views across all these different domains of knowledge, and from different vectors, whether it be Greg coming from the problem of psychology, or Ken coming from sort of a more Eastern developmental view of integration, or Roy Bhaskar coming out of the classic sort of analytical philosophical tradition in the philosophy of science. Latour thinking about it as a problem of social structure and the way in which knowledge is produced and replicated. Jason, your work in cultural critique and coming out of the humanities. What am I forgetting?
Process philosophy.
Yes, thank you. Of course, process philosophy, and all the work that you guys are doing with sort of the ontology of temporality and how that affects our view of substance metaphysics, and so on and on. We have these beautiful traditions, and now we have a moment where we can step back and, in a sense, not try to improve on them as such, but notice what's common across them in order to create something that would simplexify a foundation for using the knowledge in a powerful way for the 21st century. So how do we do what Bhaskar called underlaboring? How do we simplexify it, meaning take all of its complexity, find simplicity on the other side of it, and then that sets a foundation for these common elements or common thematics that then can inform our actual work in the world, in order to go from philosophy to praxis, go from philosophy to transformation. That's the work to be done. It's, of course, work we've already done here at the Institute, and we continue. This, in some ways, for some of us, goes back more than a decade with some of the work that we did, that Nick was heavily involved with in bringing together a little bit of a prototype of this with critical realism and integral theory back in 2012, with a set of symposia that had those two in dialogue. And the results were pretty profound because not only was it very productive, I think it was educational for both communities. I think something new, interesting and new came out of it, which was this idea that these things could be in productive and synthetic conversation in a way that they contributed to each other's strength. And I think that's something that's really important here, is that each one has this extraordinary set of strength. Whether it be the depth ontology and philosophical grounding of critical realism, the ontology of philosophy that Greg has brought from an evolutionary point of view, and it's probably the most empirically grounded of all the meta theories, whether it be the spiritual and religious vindication that Ken brought, and it's really sophisticated it's upper left sort of perspectivalism and epistemological reflexivity, and so on and so forth. Like they all have this, the pluralism of Latour and reminding us that these are actually different modes of being and they have different conditions that pertain to those modes. These are all really extraordinary lineages to start to bring into productive dialogue. So the stakes are very high. The time, of course, is right. I think I've seen now Polycrisis in the New York Times 3 times this year alone. 3 times. Just this last week, there was another mention of the Polycrisis. So clearly, there is a tailwind for the world problematic and making sense of it, having a lot of people's attention, but them not knowing exactly what to do about that or how to properly make sense of it. And so the timing is really right. It is a kairos in Nick's language. What else to say? I think I will end there. This is the first, as some of you know, with our 3-layer strategy of the Institute, this first layer of philosophy building. There's a reason why it's first, because it is the foundation upon which everything else we do sits. As we move into layer 2 and worldview enablement, as we move into social entrepreneurship and social impact innovation, and these other things, it will always be constrained by the principled cognition of layer 1. That's the entire point, to not replicate the mistakes of the postmodern move, to not replicate the mistakes of the differentiated, alienated modernity. Want to preserve all of the dignities of those things. But in order to make this practical, in order to make it usable, we have to make it fit for purpose for actual social enactment by entrepreneurs, by leaders, by policymakers, and others from layer 2 and into layer 3. That's the work of layer 1. And the question that we sit with now is, how do we institutionalize the process to really pull this off on behalf of the Institute with the group of brilliant people that we have in the room and inside the Integration Society. So with that, I'll turn it over to the esteemed colleagues who are running our research function and all the layer 1 think tank domains. And I appreciate you guys all being here to hear this.
Well, thanks for that, Rob. Yeah. So yeah, we're really excited to be kicking this off. So much of what we're trying to do here, there's kind of a core story and theory of change that we're working with, and you guys are probably getting more familiar with how we're thinking about it at this point. But we really are looking at this whole situation of like, it's so important to get this layer 1 philosophy building part right. We have to nail that part if we want to successfully move on to systems change and concrete utopian revisioning of the sociosphere and the various aspects of that. So looking at the metacrisis as like beneath the polycrisis, there's this upstream breakdown or inadequacy on the level of worldviews. We have our worldviews have these demi-realities in them. There's too many aspects of our worldviews, the modern and postmodern worldviews and traditional worldviews that don't actually express the complexity and richness of reality. So this upstream breakdown in worldviews and our systems of sense making and meaning making through which our reality is interpreted and enacted and transformed. So we're really needing to hone in on that aspect, and really look at the underlying generative logic that's generating the polycrisis, and the classic example of the Hydra of Lerna. And instead of continuing to cut off the heads of the Hydra and watching 2 or 3 grow back, let's go to the belly of the beast, look at the underlying demi-realities and the generative logic that's informing how we design social systems and technological systems, and redress the issue on that level. So we really see meta theorizing as this like a formalized process of reflecting on, comparing, integrating, and constructing worldview architectonics. And there's a lot of deep studies in the sociology of philosophy and the history that point to that actually philosophy is this process where we're helping to shape emerging worldviews. So we're trying to really lean into that consciously, self-reflexively. So this whole notion of integrative metatheory 2.0, how do we do big picture theorizing in a next level way, in a way that takes into account the postmodern critiques profoundly, and in a way that also is just more rigorous. It's like up to the best of the modernist standards of science and rationality. So we've like have a provisional articulation of what that is, and the principles that inform an integrative metatheory 2.0. So we've got methodological transparency and judgmental rationalism. So being very reflexive and clear about what are the methods and methodologies that we're using to derive our knowledge claims, making sure that our claims are up to the standards of a kind of Habermasian procedural rationality, um, and open. They're democratic, open to rigorous assessment in terms of what the validity criteria are for a given knowledge claim. Um, and so that if we want to sustain the possibility of judgmental rationality to be able to um, claim that something a particular claim is better or worse or true or false, we will also need to have a principle of epistemic reflexivity and relativity. So this whole idea of epistemic reflexivity, being aware of where we're coming from. This is a lot of the postmodern kind of perspective of understanding the ways in which our knowledge claims are mediated, our perspectives mediated by social and historical, and linguistic, psychological structures, and doing our best to be aware of that. And then just fallibility, like really understanding that our we can never lay a solid claim to the truth, but we're doing our best to potentially get closer, approximate truth, asymptotically approach truth, but always having that epistemic humility built into what we're doing. And then ontological realism and comprehensiveness. So yeah, a coherent. We're doubling down on the notion that a coherent worldview has to be a realist worldview, a neo-realist worldview. That there are aspects of reality that are indeed prior to and independent of our knowledge of reality, while also honoring that the human is participating in reality and transforming reality on a sociospheric level. Um, so yeah, and basically trying to be ontologically comprehensive, including as much as possible in our understanding of reality. And then finally, well, not finally, integrative pluralism is also another principle that we're working with here. This idea that we're not trying to produce an integrative monism and totalizing view of reality through our meta theorizing, but we're trying to integrate and honor that diversity and weave that diversity into a tapestry, a coherent tapestry, an integrated pluralism. And then finally, axiological realism and flourishing. So the notion that value is actually intrinsic to some extent in the cosmos, and that this whole process of knowledge production is not neutral, and making the claim that that flourishing, eudaimonia, ought to be our primary orientation to all of this. So those are the kind of principles that we're working with, but that's really put out there as a conversation starter. And that's really what we want to do throughout this process is identify what are the principles of a next level integrative meta theory, and that being the kind of basis of understanding what an integrative worldview is, and which again is we see as a root causal response to the meta crisis. There's three primary modes of integrative meta theory. There's the philosophical mode of looking at like the conditions for the possibility of knowledge and a lot of the um, philosophy of science and the foundations of knowledge, and then moving into so that's the alpha mode of integrated meta theory, the philosophical mode, and then there's the beta mode, which is the looking at the sciences and the special sciences and across all the disciplines and scanning across the insights from all those disciplines and synthesizing them into a meta theory beta, scientific meta theory. And then the meta theory gamma is trying to put those two pieces together, the philosophical foundations and the scientific insights, into a coherent worldview, a meta theory gamma. And as Kaman Vidal said, to paraphrase him, like the highest expression of this philosophy, this big picture inquiry, is to construct a worldview. And that's what we're trying to do in many ways. So all of this is, an open dialogical process, and there's so many amazing um, theories and minds, and we're trying to bring all you guys together to engage in a dialogue to take this to the next level, and we're very excited about that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brendan.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah. So, yeah, just to build off all of that and maybe synthesize a little bit of it from Robb's setup here in the context of what we're doing at the Institute and the cultural moment and its relationship to a kind of expansive planetary set of crises that are all interlocked, and the need to get a kind of grip on that complexity through an adequate level of complexity in our thinking about reality, to make those problems tractable in a way that they've hitherto, been unable to be. To Nick's kind of outline of sort of the broad philosophical principles and methodological principles behind this kind of endeavor, I'll get a little bit more concrete in terms of then what we're kind of here to kick off, to invite and lay out sort of the game plan here, which is to try to draw together thinkers across this meta-theoretical space, and invite them into a collaborative dialogue and conversation with one another, with existing theories. And so bringing together sort of the leading thinkers, either representative of particular models or who have already engaged in various kinds of meta-theoretical synthesis, trying to get those folks in the room to be on the same page with a very expansive set of material that needs to be covered to do this kind of work. And so we see the promise here, but to create the conditions and the container in which we can realize that is really what this invitation is all about. We've already brought a bunch of people together. We've created this integration society. We've got the journal. We've been doing research forums already where people operating in the space are sharing what they're working on, and that's been incredibly rich. And so we've already sort of started this, gotten to lay the foundations and deepen a little bit into the material and also just relationally. But now I think it's really time to get to kind of jumpstart that, or to catalyze something more focused, more integrative, and something then that's going to take in some ways more of an effort to try to pull off, right? It's one thing to bring a bunch of brilliant scholars into a room, have them present on material, and people can start to make the connections in their mind. It's another thing to get those scholars on a sort of shared track where we're working with a shared outline, a kind of schedule, trying to make sure that we're all, again, kind of working on the same page here. So have we digested these different models, and in what way are we able to then have a group conversation that can really productively make those threads, those meshes, those connections across these different things. And that requires a deeper level of sort of commitment, of responsibility. The ask is greater, and so we expect that to kind of narrow this for all sorts of reasons. People don't necessarily have the time or the bandwidth or what have you to engage in this kind of endeavor. But for those who are willing to and up to and also see the promise of this, that's what the invitation is. And in a minute, I'll throw it back to Nick to go over this document that he's put together that sort of puts out the whole vision of this and the game plan and also the schedule. But in broad overview, what I'll say is basically between now and the symposium that we have scheduled in September, we're going to be doing a series of our ongoing research fora as we've been doing, but this time dedicated to presenting particular models, having people unpack these big picture theories, and then put them into conversation with each other. We're going to be going over some of the work that's already been done to do this work that Nick and others have already been involved in. We're going to open up, the whole question of a disciplinarity level, in a sense, over and above kind of meta theory in some ways, the kinds of arch theoretical philosophical moves that happen in the meta theoretical space, and then give opportunity for this to happen in a kind of seminar style, high level consortium or colloquium, and simultaneous to that, in a kind of parallel track, we're going to be doing these podcasts that are going to give more time to deepen into this inquiry in a bit maybe more informally, and what we want to do with this is sort of multifold. On the one hand, this is the work that needs to happen. On the other hand, there's a big socializing aspect to this. So we want to socialize this work as part of, what we're doing and put this out in the world so people have a better sense of what this next step is for meta theory and for trying to apply these things in the world. At the Institute, we've already been making some efforts with our social media campaign and other things to start to kind of just daily, put things out there so that this story that we've been telling is starting to seep in and in a kind of background ambient way. People are seeing quotes from a bunch of our scholars that are kind of telling this story. And so that's a big part of this as well, that there's this work to be done, but we also want to bring people along with us to the degree that we can. So this isn't all just sort of happening in a closed room. This is part of also the kind of transparency aspect, right? We want to share this process with the world and kind of bring people on board, and so that they get, right, this notion of, oh yeah, metacrisis, planetary crisis of extreme complexity, the need for bigger pictures that can make that kind of that complex set of problems more tractable. And then as for this worldview part, what we mean by that is not necessarily that we're trying to make some sort of totalizing vision that people need to download or something, or that there's this view of reality that is just the answer that we're trying to offer here, but rather that when you engage in this kind of work, you see the world differently and you see the complexity and the depth of phenomena more acutely. And if more people are sort of operating with these sets of parameters and attending to more of those phenomena simultaneously, we think that that's really necessary to navigate the complexity of the planetary metacrisis. And so trying to make that sort of understandable, tractable, digestible for people is also a big part of this, and why we're kind of doing this in a kind of public-facing sort of way. So between now and September, we're going to kick this off. This is our official kind of launch of this effort. We're inviting our scholars into a deep engagement with this material through a series of these lectures and then open conversations. We'll be inviting these folks also for these podcasts, and we'll be putting that out into the world. And we hope over the coming months that something begins to converge, to cohere, start to come together where, we're all working partially from our own areas of expertise and knowledge. So we've got process philosophers and people deeply familiar with integral theory and critical realism and metamodernism and all these different systems, right? But we're all then probably missing something really big that another one of us can help fill in. And so by coming together, we can kind of synergistically kind of see what we're all kind of partially missing out and how we can create for ourselves a bigger sense of the picture. I think this will improve our work as individual scholars as well, apart from contributing to this collaborative effort that hopefully then on the other side of this, we can put something out into the world that people can use and feel is really, it has utility, right? So this last thing I'll say, and then I'll throw it back over to Nick. you know, for a lot of people finding these big picture models, there's a click, there's an aha, there's a sense of, oh, now I see more of the picture. I mean, that's why we call them big picture models. And it's not just that there's a kind of insight there, it's also it opens up the capacity to do different kinds of work, right? So if you're only looking at, say, the ecological crisis in a particular way, you're only looking at, say, our current, financial systems or institutions, right? And you're missing, well, how are people thinking about nature, about relationship, or this sort of thing, and you're missing, let's say, other aspects of how, yeah, let's even say worldview are being informed, but individual experiences with the ecological situation. Then you're working with sort of a broken puzzle in that sense. You're an incomplete puzzle. And so when you find these models, they're able to clue you into what should be attended to, like what's minimally needing attention, if we're going to then attempt to do any kind of constructive resolution to some of these major planetary problems. And what we want to do is we recognize the value in these different models to do that in different ways. But there's still fragmentation there. Some models are better than others at foregrounding certain phenomena. But if we can bring these together, then in a more comprehensive way, then people are going to have more powerful tools to intervene in these major planetary crises. And even knowing how best to quote unquote intervene is also something that's important here too. Part of our own thinking about what constitutes a problem and what constitutes a solution is also something that's often left out of how we're thinking about things. So, long story short there, yeah, how can we ultimately produce something that we can put into the world that can help other people in policymaking contexts, in pedagogical contexts, in all sorts of different contexts, entertainment, media, etc., to make the planetary metacrisis more tractable, more understandable, to find more effective leverage points and intervention points, and ultimately get a more comprehensive scope on reality that we believe also directly can help benefit and resolve some of the pathologies in many of our institutions. So an output very likely could be a book, a textbook, maybe. Certainly, it will be papers that go into the journal. And we've kind of, at this point, created this container to be able to do this work. And now it's really kind of starting fully in earnest today. So I'll stop rambling, kick it back to you, Nick. If you want, you can even share the document and maybe talk a little bit more about the schedule or anything else you'd like to throw in at this point. And then, yeah, in a little bit, we can also open this up for some discussion.
Great. Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah, so just sort of dovetailing off everything you shared there, Brendan. I mean, we're seeing the Integration Society, the journal, the podcast, the research forum, and the symposium as all this kind of container that's helping us cultivate this shared discourse space, this dialogue. We all, I think, can sense that there is like this a new perspective, a new understanding, a new story that points to the wholeness of reality. And that is such an important missing piece. It's the basis of a new cultural attractor that can really be the basis of a new society. So coming back to this point, so we're seeing this container as an opportunity to really be in that inquiry. We don't have all the answers fully figured out. There are many meta-theoretical approaches that have their version of it. But what happens when we refract each of them off of each other? When we look at integral theory through the lens of process philosophy and critical realism through the lens of process philosophy, and then we look at process philosophy through the lens of critical realism and integral theory, what emerges? And it's really amazing. I was, as Robb mentioned, I was one of the organizers of the Critical Realism Integral Theory Symposia series, and we spent 5 years kind of working through this process, and it was extraordinary what was revealed. We saw, you could really see, where are the places that each of these approaches really shines? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Where did they leave out something? important? Where are the contradictions? Where is there a lack of internal coherence in each of these approaches? These things really became much more obvious and clear. So there's kind of an incredible sort of stress testing element to this, which, as Brendan mentioned, can kind of go two ways. You can look at that as from the perspective of one system as like an incredible opportunity to strengthen that system. And then the other perspective is, well, how does that system fit into a larger meta system or emerging worldview or paradigm, right? And it's just really an incredible opportunity for us to advance this and move towards. I really love Corey David Barker's articulation of arch theory and arch disciplinarity. When we move beyond just the level of each of these meta theories to a new level of like what starts to come into focus as we look at reality through all the lenses of the best, most sophisticated integrative meta theories that we have. So we're really excited about engaging that process. It's a very open-ended process. We're all going to learn a lot. We don't have the answers, but we can collectively move closer, move more in resonance with reality, and start to articulate something that's hopefully the basis of a new culture. And as far as the research forum and the podcast goes, we sort of set up this series of research forums to try and sort of build somewhat systematically towards the symposium, the Synthesis Lab Symposium that will be held in Lake Tahoe, beautiful property in Lake Tahoe in the fall, in September. So we want to kind of try and get everyone up to speed. I don't think all of us are experts in all these approaches. So it's an opportunity for each of us to get to know the various frameworks that are out there, and start to think these things through, start to be in the dialogue. What are the key questions? What are the key inquiries? And yeah, so then each podcast will kind of be thematically related to the research forum that we just had, and an opportunity to kind of go deeper into that. So this whole first phase is the spring and summer of cultivating the discourse, strengthening our familiarity across these different frameworks, but also just building the field, getting to know each other. I think we really feel like that's an important part of all this, is like the friendship, the connection, the heart and soul of all this too. It's not just strictly intellectual process. And so the first research forum of this series is this one, just to lay out the game plan, articulate kind of what we're talking about with Integrative Metatheory 2.0 and what we're trying to move towards. And then we'll do a podcast that kind of goes into some of this stuff some more. And then on the 28th, we're going to talk about integral theory and critical realism and how those two approaches relate, and then do a deep dive on that in the podcast. In June 11th, we're going to talk about UTalk and integral theory. Greg will be there, so we're looking forward to that. And we're going to start to talk about some of the meta-theoretical syntheses, the arch theories that are out there. So I'll talk about my own arch theory, visionary realism a bit. And then in July, we're going to move into talking about complex integral realism, which brings together critical realism, integral theory, and complex thought from Edgar Morin. Then we're going to bring UTalk and metamodernism, Jason's work, into dialogue later in July. Really looking forward to that. And then we'll move on to talking about complex thought and process thought and how those two approaches interface. Andrew will be a part of that. Sean Kelly will be a part of that. We're going to have Corey David Barker talk about archdisciplinarity. So we're starting to move into, how do these different meta theories interface and what's the vantage point that opens up. So Corey will talk about that more systematically in terms of his notion of archdisciplinarity and arch theory. And then we're going to talk a bit about worldviews and how these arch theories start to seed our understanding of a new worldview. So Brendan will articulate a bunch of the research that we've been doing. We'll have Clement Vidal bring his perspective on worldviews, and I'll be a part of that as well, along with Rob. And then as we move into September, we're going to start to have more open discussion and start to look at some of the convergent and divergent patterns that we're seeing in that kind of archdisciplinary space. And then later in September, we'll have like a symposium preview. We'll kind of seed some of the key questions and angles from which we're going to be deep diving in the symposium, look at some of our aspirations and expectations. And then we'll have the actual symposium. They're potentially, so that the symposium's been by invite, but if anyone here is really interested in being there, there might be potentially room for some more participants or kind of participant observers. So let us know if that's something you're interested in. And then the final research forum of this series will be a post-symposium reflection, where we'll all come together and kind of harvest the insights, reflect on what happened in the symposium. And then we'll be on to phase 2, which will be moving towards some kind of product. We're thinking right now that some kind of a collective writing piece would be, an amazing thing, like a book. But that's something we'll craft together and decide on together. And then there's the possibility, we'll see how this all goes, but there's a possibility that we might have a larger gathering sometime in 2027, like a summit where we bring together a bigger field of scholars and humans to connect and explore some of these ideas together. So yeah, we're very excited. Thank you guys so much for being here, and we want to open it up now to just dialogue, ask any questions that you might have about what we're trying to do here, and yeah, thank you again.
Well, I have a question. It's probably a naive one because I'm not terribly well read in a lot of meta theories. My background was integral, but the rest I don't. But just this from critical realism, the ontology, the idea that there is reality out there. And I wonder about how that works with the spiritual side of things, with the absolute and the relative, the two truths. Is this an acknowledgement that we're working in the relative and not, or is the idea that, as many of the traditions point out, it's all an illusion, or as Ken says, it's the paper that everything is written on. I don't see that brought in very much. Is that purposely left out, or
Well, I could say one thing to this, and I mean, this will be an interesting thing. One of the things, right? I mean, integral theory is a great example of being so comprehensive, and not shying away from deep spiritual insights, non-duality, various kinds of metaphysical layerings, and all these things. And so, in some sense, any truly comprehensive, kind of big picture model will be as comprehensive as it can be. And so, if you are leaving something really fundamental out, that's that would not be ideal. One thing I think we'll be navigating though too is that this work sits at kind of an interesting nexus. It's not just multi or inter or transdisciplinary. It's kind of those and more. And so one of the things that becomes difficult there is how, in a sense, this gets uptake in institutional contexts and the line of sort of let's say disciplinary boundaries and where those end versus how much we can kind of extend them within the Overton window of sort of what's possible. So I think it'll be an interesting thing to navigate when we get people in the room, what's being surfaced and how are these all being related, and also the level of let's say a kind of like what the gradient of epistemic humility is when it comes to certain aspects of this, right? So like some things, maybe the meta theory beta sort of scientific cohesion is something we can be, in a sense, more kind of confident about epistemically as we kind of put this out of like, oh yes, there's a kind of confidence ratio to that, given all the kind of empirics that we can point to, this sort of thing. As you start moving into, the meta theory alpha and the philosophical aspect, obviously that's operating in a different register. And when you're getting into metaphysics and spirituality and non-dual, fundaments of reality, these sorts of things, there's an even broader sense of like, do we hold those phenomena or ideas in the same way that we hold, trying to fit together sort of a meta theory of psychology or something, right? So I think one, and also relates to the transparency bit, being very direct about what that epistemic gradient looks like and sort of, what we can say, oh yeah, you can take this one to the bank in the sense that you can give it to a bunch of scholars and they'll all say, oh yeah, that checks out, versus, something this would sit more with philosophers who'd be like, well, that's very debatable, to, these big metaphysical questions. So I'd say a lot of that's just part and parcel of this work. It'll be really interesting to navigate those kinds of questions, and we'll see how people bring those things into the conversation. But that all being said, we certainly want to be as comprehensive as possible. And if you're leaving out ultimate reality, then you're missing something from your model, I'd say. So.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. But I thought also that many people attracted to this work also tend to be very involved in a spiritual life of some sort. So I expect that it won't be just me raising the question.
Yeah. Thanks for that point, Lynn. And yeah, I mean, I think with the Integration Society, we are trying to approach these things in ways that are coherent with rational inquiry. And, even if it in some sense maybe goes beyond that. So, I mean, I'm very interested in kind of contemplative phenomenology and Ken's idea of broad empiricism or deep empiricism, the ways in which that, there actually is a kind of phenomenological evidence for some of these deeper realities and states, and a science of the spiritual. And then Bhaskar, brings in transcendental arguments and the ways in which we can use transcendental arguments and kind of mysteriously use the logic of the mind to reveal something that's even deeper than that, and his whole idea of a secular spirituality and the meta real. And so, yeah, I mean, I think he does a really good job of bringing together kind of in the dual and the non-dual, and then come up with a kind of rational justification for the non-dual. So yeah, that's definitely an important piece to bring into it. But I think our bias is like that it's coherent with rational inquiry.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say, from my perspective, almost one way to position that is in sort of the opposite dimension. And what I mean by that is I've been kicking around a term called gist ontology lately. So gist is, of course, the basic structure, ontology referring to what's real. And so one of the things that I've been talking a lot about, of course, throughout my career is the problem of psychology. And one way to then say that problem is there's no gist ontology for psychology. Like people don't even have a basic gist of what they mean by mind and behavior. Okay. Like when you actually ask what mind means, some people think about it as epistemic form. Some people think about consciousness. When you actually ask what behavior means, some people think about it as movement. Some people think about it as function. There's no actual way to circle the basic structure of what people are talking about. Okay. And that's remarkable. Like think about it like Copernicus, like, oh, everyone thinks the earth is the center of the universe, right? But you actually don't have the right basic gist frame for the positionality of things. So for me, what I'm really struck by these days is if you're listening to the consciousness conversation, this guy, Michael Pollan, just released The World Appears. And actually, Eric Hole had a really cool comment on it. He's a well-known researcher, and he's like, I hate this. And you know what it reveals? It reveals how bad we in consciousness research have done in the last 30 years. And the reason is because it's all ambiguous language. Like nobody knows what, there's this what researchers talk about, but actually there's sentience, and then there's actual feeling, but then there's thought, and then there's self, and blah, blah, blah. And you get this cluster F of confusion. I don't think that is necessary, actually. I think that's because the Enlightenment gap confused us. I think we can actually have a super clear way of talking about all this stuff at the level of common sense first, like this conversation. The absence of that, at least from somebody that sits with a system that seems to bring coherence to that, is unbelievably striking. And the consequences of the absence are unbelievably striking. And so while there are super important metaphysical, spiritual, transcendent, ontological questions of being itself, if we don't have a gist ontology of what the hell we're talking about mind and behavior in a common sense way, then we got an issue. And so one of the things that I'd like to, at least to be part of that conversation is those kinds of ideas. So I'll offer that.
Yeah, I've just one more quick thought on that, and then let's hear other questions or thoughts that people have. But I would say that there's a kind of Scylla and Charybdis polarity we want to avoid here, and the other kind of extreme is what currently we have, which is a sort of a science that's very reductionistic and materialistic, and often feels very disenchanted and devoid of any kind of spiritual profundity. And so that plays well in the contemporary academy, and it has in some ways a lot of that rigor that we also value, and a lot of to some degree that rational level of coherence, but it's devoid of, it's missing something, right? So I would say, for me, it is really important that this work has, however you want to language this, a spiritual component, a meaningful component, a deep axiological sense that this is really profound and significant. And there's a way in which our current worldviews are being either uninformed or malinformed by what counts as a lot of the kind of contemporary scientific discussion. And so if we are missing that kind of component, then I think we're missing something. If we are missing that, then we're missing something very important indeed. So I think, yeah, that we'll be looking at that as a lodestar for sure.
Well, what excites me about this group is, I mean, obviously the sheer diversity at one level, right, which makes things a challenge, but also a fun challenge, right? Because it's the sort of besetting sin of philosophers to assume that whatever they say, other philosophers are going to know what they're talking about. Most of the time, that's certainly not the case. So the fact of the diversity, the fact that we're going to be gathering together, building friendships first, I mean, that to me is key. We have a lot to learn, obviously, from one another. I think of, again, Whitehead being my favorite philosopher, his statement where he says, the amount of philosophy he hasn't read in comparison to the amount he has read is sort of, there's a big asymmetry there. So I have a lot to learn, certainly from many of the backgrounds of you all. I don't know everybody's work here, right? Here and there. So I think it's going to be kind of a growth process, right? Where we can cross-fertilize ideas and try to clarify goals, which I think Brendan, Nick, and Rob, you guys have done that beautifully so far. But there's a prismatic element to it as well. I've been playing with this metaphor of a prism, right? The cool thing about a prism is you transparently see through one side into others, and you see how they mutually support each other. This sense in which we're groping towards a wider Weltanschauung, right, which would allow us to treat systematically, hopefully, but not in a monolithic way, the various challenges. Nick, you made comments presupposing truth, right, which is an eminently laudable value, which has to be in place before we even get going. But it's the most likely tale, right, as Plato would say, in some sense, that we're moving towards, never sort of presupposing an absolute grasp of it, or the Pauline metaphor, right, seeing through a glass dimly, right? So I just am excited about the group here. Try to participate as much as I can over the subsequent months, and will plan to be there in September. And starting at friendship level, starting at relationships. I mean, this is setting the base for getting real movement, I think, done, because the theory and the friendship sort of collaborate and grow together. So kudos, everyone. Let's do this.
Thanks, Andrew. That's great.
Yeah, right on, Andrew. Yeah, one of the things that comes up for me as you say that too is like when we did the critical realism integral theories series, there are a number of people that like wrote to me after reading some of the books, and surprisingly, they were actually more interested and fascinated by the process that we had engaged than necessarily the outcomes or the particular perspectives that we produced. They're like, this is extraordinary. We've never seen like two different like philosophical schools come together and actually have this deep dialogue and produce something together. Like even just that, like on the level of divergence of perspective and polarization and that kind of thing. How do we do that? How do we learn how to go beyond the perspective that we're identified with? And I think so much of it is just, this frankly, I thought that the integral theory perspective is really strong on this, like this presupposition that everyone's right. There's a kind of epistemic generosity, and then yeah, the like getting together in person is also really important. Of like connecting, friendship, and being open. Just having that humility that we're all here to grow and learn and expand our horizons and open our hearts. So yeah, thanks for everything you shared, Andrew.
Nick, as long as there's a polar plunge in the morning in Tahoe, right?
Oh yeah, that's definitely going to be a thing. Just like at Star Island.
Well, I'll just echo what Andrew said. I'm excited to be a part of it, and I love the idea of focus on process at multiple levels and friendship. And I'm really appreciative of you guys starting. One thought I had, and I don't know if you guys have talked about this at all, but some orienting documents or some sort of orienting minimal kind of like frame would be useful for me, I guess, as a participant. If there'd be sort of like, hey, if you spend, 5 hours or so kind of surveying the landscape, or I don't know if we have any kind of shared background material that would make any sense to, like, we all kind of responsible at least to get the lay of the land here, have exposure to this. Like, we could all, of course, share our resources and have a large available thing, but then folks, who's going to really go through all that? It'd be a nice resource. I don't know if there's any consolidating kind of set of documents or anything that you guys are thinking about where the participants would have kind of shared, reviewed of, and bring to create some overlap and starting reference points for this. So obviously there's the set of principles, but I'll just throw that out there as something I'd be open to or might be helpful.
Yeah, I think we want to create like a reading list, and also we can, as we go through the research forums, folks can send out, hey, I'd like you to read X, Y, and Z before this forum. And then Rob, did you want to speak to Alethic and some of the ways that we were thinking about using that to support this?
Yeah, and I want to say a couple of things, and hopefully these threads can come together coherently. But I mean, if you notice a lot of what every one of these systems, and maybe going back to, Plato or like forever, there's always been a left brain move and a right brain move. There's always been a gestalt sort of story of wholeness that you're telling as a narrative in this thing. And then there's also this sort of analytical distinction making. And we should expect exactly this to be the same process, right? There's going to be this way in which we are going to generate a narrative and a story of wholeness that is developing out of this new story of wholeness. And then there's also a way in which it's like, here are these distinctions that really matter that float out of this work together synthetically. And we think that it is not unlikely that what we're headed towards on that piece here, the kind of analytical piece, is an ontoepistemic grammar that's actually going to be the hard work and the productive work. Like, how do you develop an ontoepistemic grammar that can hold the plurality of all of the integrative metatheoretical findings and their own stories, plus their constituent sciences and their constituent empiricisms? How do you have an ontoepistemic grammar that can do that? And that is where your site of integration actually is. And from that, then there is a story of wholeness that can be told that can then, and I would say that one of the things I wanted to mention here is that this is not a case where, like, we're going to go off into a cave and do this for 3 to 5 years and then come out with like the fire, right? We're already doing this. Like, this is live. So it's already shipped. Like we've already done a first version of this. The new story of wholeness.com is live. It goes out next week, but you could go to it right now for those of you who have seen it. And it's doing a first version of this. It's taking a look at here is some lenses that matter that can simplify kind of this story of wholeness for the 21st century. Now it's admittedly fallible, so we will update it as we go. So I guess what I'm saying is that this process we're about to get involved with as the next level of doing all of this is going to have a feedback loop back into actual concrete productions like the new story of wholeness.com, which is this web experience. It can have outputs in form of white papers. It'll also be informing Alethic AI because Alethic AI has been built to systematically embody the very distinctions that we're talking about here, the very arch framework, just onto epistemic grammar that we are talking about here, and its constituent integrative metatheories. That Alethic will be made available to all of you, actually, maybe even today. We actually now have authorization in place so we can enable that. Alethic is not done. It's like there's a lot more to do on it, but you'll get it as a proof of concept. You'll say, oh, this AI can help me reason about things. And it starts bringing in other IMs and it starts bringing in lenses, right? And it starts using this grammar to help me think and challenge and see things I didn't think before. So what we're going to end up creating here is we're going to be creating, I mean, actually the other way, 4 quadrants. This is going to be a 4-quadrant diachronic affair. It is going to be evolving, iterative, with public and social and cultural storytelling components. It's going to have, to your point, Andrew, it's going to be very transformative for us in the upper left as individual practitioners. It's going to have a set of tools that are evolving alongside us, and that there's a feedback loop between the tooling and the process of the philosophizing going on. And then hopefully in the lower right, there's going to be a set of structured outputs and new kinds of organizational forms that can then do actual real work in the world. I was on a call an hour ago where somebody said that, a very senior person in the government of England is paying attention to our work very closely, reading it all, and asked, about the IM 2.0, like this, the collapse of the Archimedean lever here during the Metacrisis and social morphogenesis, the collapse of the gap between the work you're doing and the way in which it can show up in novel sort of social experimentation or thinking in embodied and contingent sites in the world is collapsing to zero. It's collapsing to very, very quickly, right? So it's not like we're going to run off in 5 years, come out with the answer. Like this is happening in real time as a learning organization, and we will practice that process of instantiating this every step of the way. And perfect won't be the enemy of the good. It just won't. I mean, we're shipping all the time, and so it really is. I think when Institute of Applied Metatheory, we take that very seriously. That we apply this stuff and we apply it fast. And so anyway, that will all be made available to you at every step of the way as we go.
Yeah, I love everything you shared there, Rob. And I think that's so important is that, I mean, one liability too, when you're looking at multiple meta theories is that as you produce arches that you are kind of like reproduce, you're sort of stacking distortions, you know? So, we have to come back to that empirical layer of, on the one hand, scientifically, like just going back to the rudimentary level of empirical data and checking to see, do these frameworks and paradigms actually help us describe and accurately explain what's happening. And then in terms of applied philosophy, in terms of do they actually empower our praxis in the world? And that's just so important. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the layer 2 stuff, we're really excited to, as we feel more confident in our philosophy building and the fruits of like what we're trying to do in the symposium in the coming months and years, to get it more into concrete utopianism of looking at how do we redesign concrete systems. based on this kind of understanding and then testing that out. And I think that's the real end game that we should always keep in mind with all this.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Brendan, for explaining the work that you do so well. And Brendan, it's nice to see you again. I'm curious to the last one that you said, Nick, of layer two being the final end game, because I see the ambition of having this integrative meta theory that gives us the big picture of reality where we're at and kind of like helps us in a way like process the current moment and like metabolize the sort of complexity and anxiety that we feel. I'm sorry, living in a city. And then, yeah, and then kind of like you now saying that layer two and having this like concrete utopias and seeing how ways to translate these like meta theories in concrete directions that can inspire change. And I wonder if there's any example of work that has already been done in this like translation that has like created like real tangible impact in any field. Or if that right now is mostly like a working hypothesis that we think that these like meta theories can create change. And we're betting on that, but we haven't seen that yet.
I'll take that for a moment. I think that almost every single reality we're living in now is an example of a concrete utopia that has come out sometime in the last several hundred years, and often in the last several decades. Some theorist or academic wrote a new model that got adopted by McKinsey, that then it got adopted by institutions, that they got put in place and then downstream socialized inside of their institutional forms. So we know that the metabolic function moves from first philosophy into more applied philosophy into epistemic models that then can get taken up by institutions at times that they think it's either faddish or it meets their incentive system or it solves a problem for them. Then there's some reason it gets taken up and then gets instantiated into it. So I would say we're living in a reality which is prima facie evidence of that in every dimension. Now, of course, there's a big question about to what extent are some of those, only reflective of the ones that get selected for because of the demi-real selection ecologies that are involved institutionally, and then how do you transform that? That's certainly a real problem. But yeah, I think they're everywhere. I think it's ubiquitous, actually.
Totally. And, I would also just say that I think integral theory, the integral theory community really shines in this regard. I mean, integral theory has been applied to something like 35 disciplines and practical areas of like, from ecology and sustainability. And there's like amazing case studies where they've actually, like, for example, in BC, like issues around land use and logging and things like that. And in BC, there's in-depth case studies of how they applied the integral framework in an ecological context, and were able to achieve like pretty amazing results of like finding kind of win-win solutions that where they brought together all these different stakeholders from indigenous communities to logging companies to environmentalists and politicians, and they found pretty amazing synergistic solutions. So there is quite a long list of successful case studies of that more explicit way that some of these integrated meta theories have been applied successfully.
Could I butt in here, Nick, and give an example for Ellie, which might be quite useful. Ellie, John Maynard Keynes. Have you heard of John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist?
Yeah, of course.
Yes. So his general theory of employment, interest, and money, that goes back to 1932, right? That was probably the most important single impetus for the New Deal in terms of an academic. And that was a metatheoretical work. So he brought together classical economics, new ideas about government debt, new ideas about how employment could be generated through stimulating the economy that really helped kick the American economy out of the Depression. And it was a model that was used and still is used in 100 years almost since then, right? So I think that's a very powerful example. And he specifically took different theories of employment, both theories based on interest and on money and cost mechanisms and so forth, plus Marxist economy theory. And he took all of that and brought it into this general theory, which is called a general theory. It's a meta-theoretical book that he wrote. And he clearly understood what he was doing, because there's parts of that book where he says, this is a very specific general theory, and he gives a reason why it's an important overview and that it creates this new paradigm. And we all live in the shadow of that. And Keynes has this very famous quote that whether we know it or not, we live under the influence of some dead economist's meta theory. And he actually created that. So I think that's a very powerful example of the impact that meta theory can have. And like Rob was saying, virtually every aspect of our lives is imprinted in some way, and the worlds that we live in are enacted out of these meta-theoretical sort of positions, going all the way back. I could give many, many examples of this, but I thought that was one that, might hit home for you.
Yeah, thank you. It is very clear.
It's a great example, Mark. And Chris, to your question about why did Keynes get picked up at that time, it really goes to a metacritical observation, which is they needed it. They were in the middle of the Depression. They couldn't break out of it. They had multiple recessions that continued to recur. They needed a new model for an interventionist state economically in order to start thinking differently about the social economic contract that really had been in place since the, Gilded era, the progressive era, was trying to react to the sort of robber baron capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, but it hadn't broken through paradigmatically yet until FDR and the Depression. So it got, it's to Friedman's point about the ideas that are lying around or what gets selected for when there's a crisis. That's really it. It's not just a good idea. It's also there's got to be some crisis or some sort of selection pain that is prompting the uptake mechanism. And this goes to why so much I think of what we need to do at layer 2 is layer 1 to layer 2 is an issue of adaptation. How do you adapt philosophy and engineer it to actual sort of concrete utopianisms and actual, whatever policies, innovations, etc. That's the adapt. And then as you go from layer 2 to layer 3, you have to do adopt. And adoption is all about how does it get selected for inside of those particular contexts. And that's where the selection mechanisms really matter. And there's only a handful, right? It's got to take people out of pain. It's got to solve some problem. It's got to give them something they want. Got to make them, it's got to increase their social status. I mean, it's a very small group of things that get you adoption at the end of the day.
I guess one other point on that I would make is that, kind of what you already said, Rob, but a slightly different way of articulating that is that any practice, any praxeology is the outcome of a particular worldview or implicit meta theory. So which is an ontology, epistemology, and axiology. An understanding of what's real, how we know stuff, and what we value. It's always there's never not a practice or a applied field that you can't reconstruct, and there's an implicit understanding that they're operating from, and the deep problems that you see in any practice can always be traced back to a deep problem on the level of those understandings. So that's a powerful way to see where worldviews and meta theories connect. So it's just worldview being sort of more implicit and more kind of culturally sedimented and distributed, and the meta theory being more than like formalized process of reflecting and making that conscious and and trying to forge those understandings in ways that are more beneficial.
Yes, well said, Nick. I'm glad you brought that up.
Are there thoughts, questions, critiques of what we're doing here?
Just a big thumbs up. I mean, fantastic. Wonderful.
That's what I'd say too. So proud of what you guys are putting into motion and all the different pieces and the players. And I'm just so excited to see how it bears fruit. So I just like being a fly on the wall for all the process.
Thank you, Laura. And I want to call out the IVC you have in the background behind you, the Integrative Values Charter, which we launched that 3 weeks ago. That also instantiates the arch framework primitives we're talking about here. And so again, that's another example of theory to practice, or in this case, arch framework to practice.
One of the things that and this will not sound new, but really I'm just double clicking on it. This move into worldview and why now? There's the poly crisis we're talking about all the time, metacrisis, whatever, and the need for it. I think there's a lot of rationale. I think there's a vibe sense that people understand. But for me, at least, one of the things that I think is definitely needing to be articulated is why now, in the sense that why we can do this now, and why we couldn't do this before. And the point I'll make is just sort of like, it's only really been the last year, and this is some of what Brendan was doing with worldview, that it just fundamentally clicked on me that actually science does not provide a worldview, period. And certainly modern science can't even provide a decent ontology in the gist ontology sense of being in the world, yet alone extend into values and practice. So I guess to me, the things is that I think we are at the cusp of a coherent integrated pluralism, precisely because we've had insights that enable us to see things that we couldn't see before, and thus cross the bridge, or in my language, dissolve the enlightenment gap and see the whole, and get people kind of realizing, wow, we've been broken on this because we didn't know what we were doing about how to get there. But this kind of synthetic integrative meta theory move is exactly what was necessary to consolidate what was missing before. And through that bridge is what we can achieve and find the new story of wholeness on the other side, and sort of get people clear as to this integrative developmental process, as to why it's unfolding and why this affords us things that really weren't available to us in the past, and why it's available now. So that's I guess that's a theme that I'd like to make sure sort of gets double clicked on a couple times.
Yeah, it's a great point, Greg, and it's actually remarkable to think about the fact that AI is arising right alongside it. So we get this amazing epistemic tooling that is able to help us with that very process of integration at the same time. Oh, and by the way, super smart and decentralizable, and it can do it at scale. So it's like, wow, why now? Well, because you have this extraordinary combination of systematic release at the level of the world's historic socio-evolutionary system on the one hand, on a global level. You have this set of technologies and tools that have emerged that provide us extraordinary capacity for new kind of real-time sense making at scale in an integrative way. And you have the philosophical and worldview resources combining and cohering for the first time to be able to provide the architectures of integrated pluralistic wholeness that you can embed inside that. Like, that's it. It's stunning, actually.
And it's unbelievable. I'll just say it. Mossy and I lived this a little bit yesterday. She had built a bot on a new and better psychology. That's what we're working on. I have a UTalk expert chat bot. And we just put them in conversation with each other, sitting around and, put the phones on and had them talk to each other. And that, it was, just unbelievable, actually, as they sort of bounced off each other and then got clarity. And that freaking transcript on what UTalk is and how it leads to a new and better psychology was pretty mind-blowing, frankly. It was bound, it was tight, it was clean, it didn't get a lot of slop. I was really, really, really impressed. And it was generative too. So anyway, it's just a sample of like, yeah, there's an intersection that's happening here. And if we can leverage it and afford and show people that it's actually, it can address a lot of the pains and coordinate us toward wisdom, that'd be a beautiful thing for sure.
Yeah. I also want to just weave together a couple of those things there, because there's the other side to AI, which is, yes, there's all these affordances and all of that, but there's also a lot of onto epistemic confusion fueling basically a bottleneck, I think, before us. And this gets to Robb's point about pain points and what people need and why is their adoption. The other aspect to the AI thing and why now is that a more sophisticated, more comprehensive, accurate integrative meta theory is needed for the engineering problems that are currently being faced by the people at the leading edge of this technology. And so the urgency there is also like, you know, you see this every day now, it seems, with the confusion around, oh, you know, like Richard Dawkins talking to an AI, oh, it must be conscious and these sorts of things. I mean, like it reveals a lot of sort of the background misunderstanding that a lot of people have been laboring under, and that is all being, you know, fed into whatever this technology is or can be. And so, yeah, if we don't understand the alignment problem, we're not going to solve the alignment problem. The alignment problem, for example, is probably misframed entirely. And if you don't have an integrative meta theory that can help you with that, then, you know, so yeah, the other, you know, why now relative to all the AI situation is there. I also wanted to underscore the new knowledge bit that you're getting at, Greg. I mean, just reading your work and what you've done to clarify the nature of mind, it's still shocking to me, and I see it all the time, you know, the three big bangs and all of this, you know, matter life culture. And it's like, wow, we're so flying blind in terms of how we think about all the incredibly rich architecture that you've been able to map out, you know, with a lot of engagement and support and conversation with other people doing these kinds of things. It's just like that we, you know, I mean, we're talking yes theory in some ways, but in a sense, I would say we know that now, like, or we should know that now. You know, we don't have the excuse to just, you know, use these older incomplete models in the same way. And it's taken people doing that work to fill in these gaps. So that's another big, like, you know, why now in a way that we just didn't have that 20, 30 years ago. So I wanted to say those two things. And then one more thing I wanted to say too, which I don't mean to sound as a downer, but it's an interesting qualification to a lot of this as well, which came up with what Ellie was saying, or asking about the question of, yeah, adoption and uptake of meta theories and whatnot. I think a lot of what we see is an adoption of broken big picture models, right? So there's a way in which, and I mean, yeah, you can also, you know, you can use specific examples. You can talk about the adoption of sort of paradigmatic postmodernism in the academy and what, you know, implications that has, or paradigmatic materialism in the forms of natural science, and the cascading confusions downstream of how the adoption of these paradigmatic models then help to produce a fragmented, broken sort of world. And so I say that partly because, like, yeah, meta theory adoption is just the name of the game, to Robb's point, but it matters, like, the quality of those big picture models that are being picked up. And it kind of means that we don't have a choice to do this kind of work, right? If we're not trying to make the best kinds of framings and integrative moves that we can do to tell the biggest picture possible and get into that deep alethic resonance, other people are going to do that less effectively, and those things are going to gain adoption, and they're going to continue to be ineffective and cause all sorts of downstream problems. And we should be reflexive of the fact that this is also what meta theories do. They're often incomplete. They're always, you know, incomplete, right? And so we should also be aware that in our own effort to do this, we can try the best that we can. But there's going to be broken pieces that even in the best case scenario, adoption scenarios where these get picked up and implied in across all sorts of contexts, it's going to reveal the inadequacies of whatever, you know, the best thing that we've been able to come up with. So there's something about the inevitability of sort of big picture adoption. But there's also the inevitability of its inadequacy, and I think that should, you know, that feeds into this sort of more chastened integrative meta theory 2.0 that's sort of reflexively aware of that fundamental incompleteness of a lot of this, and I think is also a good kind of qualification to make when we're often talking about, you know, the big picture and synthesis and all this kind of profound consilience, is always sort of the asterisk there of, like, you know, yeah, and you're leaving out, you know, things you don't even know that you're leaving out, and that should also, yeah, kind of create a humility around the work itself, and yet it needs to be done. So I wanted to throw that in there.
Alethic will dissuade you of that risk. You'll feel like an idiot every time. You've got it.
Yeah,
Well
David,
said, Brett.
exactly. I am 3.0. Yeah, it's the ever receding horizon, right? I love that about
Yeah,
Godal's.
Mark loves that.
Yeah, we're never gonna arrive. So the best we can do is get really good at navigating that process, and getting better at it. And then the last thing I would add to your comment there, Greg, about, you know, why now is, you know, I would say existential risk, right? It's like, I mean, unless you are of the school that, everything all the problems we're facing right now are sort of technical steering problems, then it points to the necessity for, transforming our deeper understanding of reality, as a essential, a way of trying to actually continue our civilization. So yeah, the meta crisis is a forcing function for this kind of process.
Yeah, if you believe Sharma's point in Noema yesterday about the new axial age, which I think several of us probably buy into a version of that, then there is an inevitability in the sense that the integration and the problems that have happened, we've been so successful that now we either integrate or we're in big trouble. And that's a forcing function at a civilizational, species, and long-term evolutionary arc point of view. That's a pretty easy case to make for those of us, in the room here. And if it's accurate, well, then it's like, what choice do you have? That's the work to be done.
Yeah, I think another way of understanding the meta crisis is kind of like a quickening of this feedback between world and worldview, the feedback loop. And so, to whatever extent our worldview is inadequate, and out of resonance with reality, that's going to be fed back to us, in the form of deepening existential risks. And yeah, so it's it's an extremely necessary process that we're doing our best to engage in here.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful way of putting it, Nick. The feedback between world and worldview. Yeah, especially in these accelerated times is like perfect framework.
Yeah, that feedback, that accelerating feedback loop is one of the technical ways to think about social morphogenesis, in the critical realist sociological tradition. That social morphogenic function is one where the structures start to destabilize and now can't reproduce themselves because the conditions are changing such that they can no longer reproduce themselves, and you end up in now a truly morphogenic process where kind of, and there's a lot of opportunity in that, obviously, but there's also a potential for breakdown or whatever.